Every country is built on a foundation of laws and legislation. These laws allow us to live in a peaceful society, while ensuring those who do wrong are punished. Some true crime cases are so brutal that they inspire major law reforms that change the legislature landscape forever. While Amber Hagerman had just 9 short years on this earth, she left behind a lasting legacy that has saved thousands of children. Amber Renee Hagerman was described as a sweet and loving child who enjoyed playing with her 5-year-old brother, Ricky. She was doing well in school, and her family were eager to see what kind of person she would become. Unfortunately, Amber's bright future and the promise of a quiet family life were cruelly ripped from her on a chilly January afternoon. Amber Hagerman was born to parents Richard Hagerman and Donna Williams on November 25, 1986, in Arlington, Texas. According to Donna, the relationship between the pair was less than ideal. In 1990, Richard and Donna welcomed Ricky into the world, and Amber quickly became a protective big sister. Shortly after the birth of Ricky, Donna fled the relationship, later citing abuse and violence at the hands of Richard. Donna was now a single mother with 2 young children, but she had a vast support system to call upon. Amber's maternal grandparents were actively involved in her life, and Donna was receiving welfare to make ends meet. In the mid-1990s, Donna agreed to participate in a documentary that followed the lives of welfare benefit recipients. Footage of Amber was billed to be used in the documentary, but this footage would be used later for a much darker reason. By 1996, 9-year-old Amber was a happy and lively child with a bright future ahead of her. She was kind, conscientious, and beginning to find her place in the world. January 12, 1996 would have been another typical day for Amber, Donna, and Ricky. The trio hopped into the family car and drove the short distance to the home of their maternal grandparents, Glenda and Jimmy Whitson, who also lived in Arlington, Texas. While the adults talked, Amber and Ricky were permitted to play outside on the new bicycles that they received for Christmas. Donna reminded the pair that they were only allowed to venture a block from their grandparents' home, and usually the two stuck to this. But January 12th was different. Temperatures were unseasonably high, and Amber wanted to test her new bike. Amber knew that just 2 blocks from her grandparents' home, there was an abandoned Winn-Dixie supermarket and a parking lot. The parking lot contained a ramp that Amber was eager to try out. Ricky, being the younger of the pair, was far more cautious, reminding Amber they weren't allowed to venture that far. After several minutes of gentle coaxing, Amber convinced Ricky to accompany her, and the two were off. Just minutes into their excursion, Ricky returned to his grandparents' house, terrified of the repercussions if they found out. His last memory of his sister is seeing her riding her new bike. When Ricky arrived at his grandparents' house, his mother immediately sent him back out to get his sister. But when he arrived at the parking lot, there was no sign of Amber. Donna, Glenda, and Jimmy came shortly after and found Amber's brand new pink bike thrown to the ground, wheels still spinning. Donna was immediately sent into a panic and began screaming out for Amber. It didn't take long for Donna to realize her little girl was missing. A call to the Arlington Police Department was placed, and within minutes the car park was flooded with cars. Shortly after Arlington police officers arrived, they received a startling tip. 78-year-old Jimmy Kevill was in his back garden when he saw a black 1980s or 90s pickup truck pull up beside Amber. The engine quietly hummed as a man jumped out, grabbed Amber, and threw her into the truck. Jimmy described the man as white or Hispanic, in his 20s or 30s, 6 foot with brown or black hair. Within a space of just 8 minutes, Amber Hagerman had been ripped from her bike and thrown into a stranger's truck. Jimmy had also placed a 911 call moments after he witnessed the abduction. The truck was last seen speeding off west on East Abrams Street before it drove out of view. Investigators immediately tried to track down the vehicle and the driver, but it was useless. The news of Amber's disappearance spread fast, though, and Arlington residents kept a close eye out for the missing girl. Donna made multiple media appeals for her daughter's safe return, begging her captor to let her go. 4 days later, a man walking his dog behind the Forest Ridge apartment complex found Amber's body by a creek. She suffered devastating injuries and was kept alive for 2 days before passing away. Investigators believed her body had been placed further upstream, but heavy rains had overflown the creek, forcing her body downstream. The discovery of Amber's body rocked the community and her family. Her father, Richard Hagerman, told WFTV that at first he refused to believe the news. Amber had suffered a great deal of brutality at the hands of her assailant, and residents were left terrified. On January 20th, 1996, 9-year-old Amber Hagerman was laid to rest at the First United Methodist Church in Arlington. Her coffin was adorned with ribbons and bows in pink, her favorite color, and over 2,000 people attended. At this point, investigators were on high alert. But in the 27 years since Amber's disappearance, over 7,000 leads have been followed, but none of them has led to the perpetrator. A dedicated tip line was created in 1996, and the line still receives tips from residents and amateur sleuths. Despite the amount of time, effort, and money that's been poured into this investigation, the Arlington Police Department is yet to make any significant arrests. In January of 2021, the Arlington Police Department announced that they'd uncovered new DNA evidence and were working with several agencies to explore the possibilities of genetic genealogical testing. Unfortunately, over 27 years later, Amber's case remains cold, but that hasn't dampened Amber's incredible legacy. After her disappearance, Dallas-Fort Worth broadcasters, local police departments, and Diane Simone began testing a new emergency broadcast. The broadcast system aimed to operate akin to civil defense and weather alerts via TV and radio. Alerts of missing or abducted children would be broadcast around the county and often beyond, making people aware of the situation. The system, America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response, or Amber Alert System, was named after Amber Hagerman, the girl who inspired it all. Since its inception, the Amber Alert System has grown exponentially and is widely utilized in the US. Alerts are sent via phone, TV, radio, and cases must meet specific criteria to broadcast. Incredibly, just 2 years after Amber disappeared, the Amber Alert System saved its first child. Since its inception in 1996, the Amber Alert System has aided in the recovery of over 1,029 missing children. The alert system has been adopted into law and is one of the best tools for modern law enforcement. Had an alert system been in place back in January of '96, Amber Hagerman may not have been the catalyst needed to spark a safeguarding revolution. In early 2007, 36-year-old Claire Wood was scrolling through Facebook when she came across the profile of 40-year-old George Appleton. Claire was immediately attracted to George and was pleasantly surprised to see that he lived in Salford, Greater Manchester. Within hours, the two began chatting via instant messenger and immediately hit it off. Claire buzzed with excitement every time her phone chimed. In just 1 year, Claire's life would take a dark turn and spark one of the most significant law reforms in UK history. Claire Wood had been single for a while and had been focusing on raising her daughter. She was exceptionally close with her mother and father, who were also actively involved in their granddaughter's life. From the outside, Claire seemed to be living the perfect life. She had a good job, a daughter who was doing well in school, and a solid support system. Claire wasn't necessarily looking for love, but butterflies flew in her stomach when she scrolled past George's profile. The two became Facebook friends and exchanged a flurry of messages and eventually agreed to meet up. Their initial meeting was everything Claire had hoped for, and within weeks of meeting, the two began dating. George complimented Claire at every opportunity and seemed to be the perfect boyfriend. Unbeknownst to Claire, George Appleton was harboring a dark and dangerous temperament. Shortly after getting together, Claire and George made an 80-mile round trip from Salford to Batley in West Yorkshire to meet Claire's father, Michael Brown. According to Michael, the meeting was very out of the blue, and he sensed something was wrong when he crossed the threshold of his home. Michael Wood had instantly disliked George, and Claire could see why. Claire explained to her father that George was a good man but had a somewhat shady past. Over the years, he was imprisoned and on parole for various motoring offenses. Michael and the rest of Claire's family were horrified to hear her new boyfriend was an ex-con and desperately tried to uncover more. Unfortunately, at the time, they were unable to access arrest or prison records for George. Days later, Claire and George returned to Salford, marking one of the last times Michael would ever see his daughter. The relationship between Claire and George deteriorated rapidly. Once the honeymoon period had ended, the love bombing stopped and George revealed his true self. He became violent, abusive, and coercive. In October of 2008, Claire found the strength to break off the relationship with George once and for all, telling him to take his things and never return. During their relationship, Claire discovered that George had had multiple affairs with different women. He found these women like he found Claire through Facebook and dating apps. This proved too much for Claire and the relationship was over, at least for Claire. George refused to let go and began bombarding Claire with abuse and hatred. He would send dozens of messages to her begging for forgiveness. When that didn't work, he would turn violent, threatening to burn her house down. As weeks passed, George moved from verbal threats to physical ones. On several occasions, he turned up at her St. Simon Street home, attempting to break the door down and hurt Claire. He also strangled, beat, and assaulted Claire on several occasions. Claire was terrified of George and was so frightened that she didn't tell her family the full extent of the abuse. Her father, Michael, later told the Manchester Evening News he only knew George was being a nuisance, but in reality, George had assaulted Claire. Between October of 2008 and February of 2009, Claire made multiple visits to the Greater Manchester Police to report George's violent behavior. Upon taking the report, the GMP discovered that George Appleton had previous convictions that were not motor-related. According to the BBC, George had been sentenced to 3 years in prison in 2002 for harassing a woman. He had also received a 6-month sentence for breaching a restraining order. The response from the Greater Manchester Police was incredibly disappointing. As reported by The Guardian, it took GMP over 24 hours to respond to a 999 call placed by Claire. She had called emergency services after George had appeared at her house and began banging on the door, threatening to end her life. There were also several other occasions where Claire's reports were mishandled or swept under the rug. In response to George, Claire filed for a restraining order and hoped this would bring some peace back into her life. But the order did little to deter George, who continued to turn up at her home and attempt to gain entry. In late January 2009, Claire installed a panic alarm in her home after George had smashed down the front door and tried to assault her. Despite all these measures, Claire was not safe from this monster. The Greater Manchester Police would later be heavily criticized for their inactions and inability to respond to severe events. Weeks after Claire installed the panic alarm, the unthinkable would happen. February 2nd, 2009 marked the day the lives of the Wood family changed forever. Claire was found in her St. Simon Street home, deceased. She'd been asphyxiated before being set on fire. Claire's passing tore the family apart, and Michael knew precisely who was responsible: George Appleton. In the days after the incident, the Greater Manchester Police scrambled to arrest George Appleton, who had gone on the run. Their chase ended 6 days later when his body was discovered in a derelict pub in Salford, forever casting a dark shadow over the area. An inquest into Claire's case was ordered, and multiple failures and inadequacies were found. Several governmental bodies had failed Claire, but Michael Brown channeled his anger elsewhere instead of becoming bitter. Michael Brown, Claire's father, has been a vocal critic of all agencies involved and has been the driving force behind Claire's Law, which was enacted into law in England and Wales in 2014. Claire's Law allows anyone over the age of 16, regardless of whether they're in a heterosexual or homosexual relationship, to receive information about their partner's criminal history. George Appleton's criminal history and maltreatment of women were known to the Greater Manchester Police. However, laws at the time prevented them from disclosing this information to Claire Wood. Claire's Law also allows family members and close friends to request the same information under the right to ask or right to know schemes. Had this law been in place in 2008, Michael Brown and Claire's family would have been privy to George Appleton's extensive violent history. Claire's Law has gone on to help hundreds across the country, as well as spark debate surrounding domestic violence laws and sentencing for offenders. 21-year-old Rebecca Lucille Schaeffer was about to become a breakout Hollywood star in early 1989. Rebecca, who's often dubbed as one of Hollywood's sweethearts, had enacted a few minor roles prior to her big push. Rebecca was excited to see where her career would take her and had even moved to Los Angeles to prepare herself for future roles. Before the world could witness Rebecca's silver screen acting skills, she was cruelly taken away by a man who should have never had access to her. Born to parents Dana and Benson Schaeffer in Eugene, Oregon, Rebecca had a comfortable upbringing. Both parents were well respected within their fields, and the family lived in a large home. From an early age, it was clear that Rebecca had star power, and her parents continued to foster her talents. At one point, Rebecca had also set her sights on becoming a rabbi in a nod to her Jewish heritage, but eventually settled on acting. At just 14, Rebecca picked up her first modeling contract, and it was an instant hit. 2 years later, she received the opportunity to move to New York and star in Guiding Llite, a soap opera. Many other opportunities would come Rebecca's way. While acting in soap operas and small productions, Rebecca continued to model, wowing agents across the city. In 1984, Rebecca landed her first significant leading role in the sitcom My Sister Sam. Rebecca worked alongside co-star Pam Dauber on the set of My Sister Sam for several years. Pam later told ABC that she, Rebecca, was remarkably good for somebody at that age. She had a certain presence and a confidence that exudes on the screen. The first season of My Sister Sam was a hit, and audiences across the US tuned in their thousands to watch Rebecca. The show amassed Rebecca a small following of loyal fans who would send her teddy bears and write letters. Amongst them was Robert John Bardo. To Rebecca, Robert Bardo seemed like an ordinary fan who enjoyed her work on My Sister Sam. But something about Bardo was different. During filming in 1987, Bardo arrived on set armed with a teddy bear and flowers to give to Rebecca. Thankfully, security removed him from the set before anyone could be harmed, but this would not be the last time that Robert Bardo tried to get close to his idol. Rebecca received numerous letters from fans and often responded to them, including letters from Robert Bardo. Those who knew Rebecca described her as a bright and kind young woman with a radiant, cheery glow. In her letter to Bardo, she stated, "Yours was the nicest I got." Robert Bardo's obsession with Rebecca Schaeffer began to turn dark. The letters continued, with Rebecca trying her best to remain cordial. After 2 seasons, My Sister Sam was canceled in 1988 or 89, as ratings had plummeted and Rebecca was looking for new projects. By 1989, the Godfather franchise was reaching its peak, and the third installment promised to be the perfect ending. Casting directors in Hollywood were looking for the perfect young actress to play the daughter of Michael Corleone, and Hollywood agents had just the person, Rebecca Schaeffer. On July 18, 1989, Rebecca waited patiently in her West Hollywood apartment for the script to be delivered. She had just a few days to learn her lines and impressed casting directors. That morning, Rebecca received a knock at the door, but instead of being greeted by her agent, she saw the face of 19-year-old Robert John Bardo. Bardo had taken his obsession to the next level, traveling over 526 miles from his Arizona home to see Rebecca. Upon answering the door, Rebecca was kind and patient with who she believed to be a fan. Minutes later, she wrapped up the conversation, telling Bardo she needed to prepare for her big moment. At that moment, Bardo felt betrayed and rejected, and his frustration reached a boiling point. An hour later, Bardo knocked on her door again and was met by an impatient Rebecca. Rebecca told Bardo to make it quick as she was busy. Seconds later, Bardo raised his firearm and pointed it at Rebecca's chest. Within seconds, Rebecca was clutching her chest on the ground and Bardo was gone. Rebecca was transported to the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center but was declared deceased upon arrival. Robert Bardo had made a speedy getaway to the bus station. On his bus ride back to Tucson, Arizona, he was seen clutching his copy of The Catcher in the Rye. Rebecca's passing sent ripples through Hollywood and caused much controversy. How had a crazed fan obtained Rebecca's address and approached her property? Investigators quickly tracked down Robert and uncovered enough evidence to warrant an arrest. When questioned, Robert revealed to investigators how he found Rebecca's address, and they were left speechless. Bardo had paid a private investigator $250 to find Rebecca's address using the DMV records. For just $4, the DMV gave the private investigator Rebecca Schaeffer's address. This was then passed on to Robert Bardo. During questioning, Robert revealed the motive behind the senseless crime. Rebecca had starred in a comedy film where she was in bed with another star. Robert took this personally and became upset that Rebecca was impure like the other women in Hollywood. He decided that she needed to learn a lesson. In a letter to his sister, written before the crime, Robert said, quote, "I have an obsession with the unattainable. I have to eliminate what I cannot attain." Bardot made a full confession, and there were questions surrounding his mental state. His sister informed the court that her brother was mentally ill and had suffered a traumatic upbringing. In December of 1991, Robert John Bardot was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Rebecca's case sparked significant outrage, most of which was aimed at the DMV. Her passing caused major law reforms, and in 1994, the Driver's Privacy Protection Act was enacted. Rebecca's case was also fundamental in helping to pass anti-stalking laws and updating existing legislation. Each year, hundreds of women are affected by these issues, and we can only hope that the legal system will be one step ahead. Tylenol is one of the most commonly used medications in the world. It's incredibly cheap to produce and sell and works for various issues: aches, pains, temperatures, and headaches, to name a few. Pain relief has become so ingrained in our daily lives that most of us don't stop to think about where the tablets came from or how they were produced. In 1982, the world received a shocking wake-up call following a spate of passings in Chicago, Illinois. 27-year-old Adam Janus awoke on September 29, 1982, with mild aches and pains. He drove to his nearest supermarket and bought a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. He swallowed 2 tablets and prepared himself a comfy spot on the sofa. Adam never made it to the sofa, though. Minutes after taking the Tylenol, he screamed out in pain before collapsing to the floor. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, but nothing could be done to help him. Hours later, he was declared deceased. Initially, doctors and nurses believed Adam had passed away due to a heart attack. No suspicious symptoms were displayed leading up to his collapse, and his condition was unexplainable. That afternoon, Adam's brother, 25-year-old Stanley Janus, and his sister-in-law, 19-year-old Teresa, also took 2 extra-strength Tylenols to squash their headaches. Within minutes of each other, the 2 collapsed, crying out in anguish. They were rushed to the hospital, but neither of them survived either. Doctors were becoming suspicious of the Janus home. 3 people from the same household had presented the same bizarre symptoms just hours apart. But what was the common denominator? Helen Jensen, a nurse at the hospital where the Januses had been treated, was sent to the family's home to investigate. According to the Chicago Tribune, Helen collected a pot of coffee, coffee grounds, jarred fruits, cherry juice, a pound cake, prescription medication, and the extra-strength Tylenol bottle, complete with the receipt. Helen was meticulous in her examination and discovered that there were only 44 tablets left in the Tylenol bottle that was sold in a quantity of 50. Just as doctors and investigators were getting their heads around the Janus case, more victims flooded into Chicago hospitals with similar symptoms. Victims reported feeling dizzy, sick and unwell, and collapsing to the floor. At around 9 p.m. on September 29th, 35-year-old Paula Prince stopped at a nearby store, grabbing a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol for just $2.39. She returned to her apartment, took 2 tablets, and waited for her pains to ease away. As she moved around her home getting ready for bed, a sickly feeling washed over her. Minutes later, Paula collapsed and became unresponsive, eventually passing away. A friend of Paula's found her body 2 days later when she failed to attend work. The Chicago Police Department was sent to Paula's apartment to search for clues, and it didn't take long for them to uncover the extra-strength Tylenol. Samples from each victim's home were obtained and sent to the crime lab for testing. At this point, Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturers of Tylenol, halted production and distribution of the product. Statewide alerts were broadcast, giving people the numbers of possibly contaminated batches and how to dispose of them. The general public panicked over what was now called the Chicago Tylenol murders. The FBI quickly joined the investigation, and thanks to combined efforts, analysts discovered the Tylenol tablets had been tainted with potassium cyanide. The batch numbers provided had been manufactured at opposite ends of the US, ruling out any production site contamination. It was now believed the Tylenol tablets had been tampered with on the shelf, leaving consumers vulnerable. In total, 7 people lost their lives: Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary Kellerman, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Rayner, with dozens more affected by the tainted tablets. In response to the poisoning, Johnson & Johnson recalled over 31 million Tylenol bottles, and the public began demanding change. The illusion of safety when taking something as simple as a painkiller had been washed away. As Chicago panicked, Johnson & Johnson received a letter that would shock them to their core. The letter demanded a ransom of $1 million in order to make the poisonings stop. This threat was taken extremely seriously, and it didn't take long before a suspect was in custody. James Lewis admits to writing the letter, but so far has never been officially tied to the Chicago Tylenol murders. NBC Chicago reported that Lewis was sentenced to several years in prison for extortion shortly after the letter was sent, but no other charges have ever been filed against him. With over 31 million bottles recalled, Johnson & Johnson and the US government knew that they needed to make a change. Lawmakers upgraded product tampering to a federal crime, and safety caps were introduced. These new tamper-proof caps made it much harder to access the product and left behind evidence that it had been tampered with. This new tamper-proof technology was applied not just to bottles of medication, but a range of products from boxes to bags were also introduced. These new tamper-proof lids may cause a great deal of frustration for many of us, but they serve a fundamental purpose. 22-year-old Helen McCourt was described as a happy and bright young woman with the world at her feet. Helen lived with her family in St. Helens, Merseyside, England, and was beginning to form the basis of her adult life. Helen worked as an insurance clerk and was keen to work her way up the corporate ladder. She had recently begun seeing a new boyfriend and was in the honeymoon stage of her relationship. Everything was terrific for Helen until she crossed paths with the wrong man. The bright future Helen was sure to have had was ripped away from her, and her case would mark significant turning points in British legal history. At around 4 p.m. on February 9, 1988, Helen called her mother Marie to let her know that she would be leaving work soon. The two chatted, with Helen telling her mother she planned on getting home, washing her hair, and getting ready for her big date. Helen glowed excitedly over the date with her new boyfriend, and she was eager to leave the office when the clock struck 4. This would be the last time Helen McCourt was ever seen or heard from again. Helen left the office that afternoon with a smile on her face. She boarded the bus, headed for Blanch St. Helens, and watched as the world went by. At 5:15 p.m., Helen alighted and began the short walk to her home. Her route saw her past the George and Dragon pub, where Helen was no longer welcome. On February 7, 1988, the landlord, 31-year-old Ian Sims, barred Helen from the pub. According to reports, Helen argued with Sims and another woman at the pub. Sims also made unwanted advances towards Helen, which caused her to argue with him further. The argument exploded when Sims hurled abuse at Helen, calling her, as the Sun put it, obscene words. Helen was barred from the pub during this argument, and the screaming match continued outside. Helen also hinted that she knew Ian Sims was having an affair with a woman 10 years his junior. Ian Sims was a married father, and rumors of an affair would ruin not only his marriage but his business. Eventually, the argument cooled off, with Helen walking back to her home. Those there that night described how Ian Sims displayed a particular callousness and cruelty towards Helen. As the clock struck 7, Marie McCourt began to worry. Helen still hadn't returned home. In an interview with The Independent, Marie revealed she began calling Helen's work, hospitals, friends, transport companies, and eventually the police. The Merseyside police told her not to worry and ignored her concerns. This stance would be reversed when Helen McCourt failed to show up by the morning of February 10, 1988. News of Helen's disappearance hit the local community, and rumors swelled. A witness came forward to tell investigators they heard a scream emanating from the pub the night that Helen disappeared. Other witnesses have placed Helen walking outside of the pub on her route home. The Merseyside police immediately turned their suspicions to the pub's landlord, Ian Sims, given the pair's recent history. When officers asked Sims about Helen, his entire demeanor changed. He became nervous and defensive. The Merseyside police continued to push Ian Sims and were able to conduct searches of his flat and car. In his car, police found several key items of interest, including a red stain and a pearl and an opal earring. Marie was shown the earring and confirmed that she'd given the earrings to Helen as a 21st birthday present. Forensic scientists were able to confirm the red spots in Ian's car also belonged to Helen. While searching his flat, officers found an earring bag and more red stains on the carpet, wallpaper, and door. The evidence against Ian Sims was mounting, as was the pressure. Weeks later, the Merseyside Police Department received another shock when a bag containing Helen's clothes washed up on a river in Manchester. Several items of Helen's clothing were stuffed inside the bag, including underwear, but that wasn't the only interesting clue. To their surprise, officers also found a jacket that belonged to none other than Ian Sims. The Merseyside police were able to utilize fibers found on Helen's clothes to place her in a flat above the George and Dragon. As reported by the Liverpool Echo, fibers from carpets of Sims' flat were found on Helen's clothes, indicating she was dragged upstairs after being struck down. The trash bag also contained some electrical wire with strands of Helen's hair on it and bite marks that were matched to Sims' Rottweiler. With mounting evidence, Ian Sims was arrested and charged in the disappearance of Helen McCourt. Helen's case received nationwide attention, and the nation waited for Sims' trial. At trial, Sims tried to argue that the clothes found belonged to him and his 21-year-old mistress. But the Merseyside police used DNA evidence to prove the red marks found in his flat belonged to Helen. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments were put forth and a verdict was awaited. It didn't take long for a guilty verdict to be returned. Ian Sims was sentenced to life in prison with the minimum of 16 years before he would be eligible for parole. During his time in prison, Ian consistently maintained his innocence and repeatedly challenged the DNA evidence presented at trial. Ian has never given up the location of Helen's body, angering her family and the general public. Marie McCourt fiercely campaigned for her daughter, begging Ian to tell her where she was buried. In March of 2019, Ian Sims was temporarily released from prison with a view to release him permanently. This was a move that angered not only Marie but the general public and many politicians. Months later, the UK government announced a landmark ruling stating Helen's Law, which would require an offender to divulge the location of their victims before they're considered for parole, and this would be enacted in law in England and Wales in the future. Enacting a policy into law is a long and drawn-out process in the UK, especially when applying those laws to Scotland and Northern Ireland, which have their own judicial systems. Disturbingly, Ian Sims was deemed fit for parole in late 2019 and released indefinitely in early 2020 before Helen's Law could be enacted. Ian Sims passed away in 2022 without ever revealing where he had disposed of Helen. While Helen's Law was a turning point for the British judicial system, it has come under fire. It was enacted too late to make a difference in Helen's case, and some believe the law is not strong enough. Marie McCourt continues to push Merseyside police to find her daughter's remains so that she can have a proper burial. Jennifer Pulliam grew up on Cody Road near the Mobile Fairgrounds in the U.S. state of Alabama. Her grandparents made a home there beginning in 1965. The brick and stucco home sat on a sprawling 11-acre property, to which Jennifer moved when she was just 10 years old. As an adult, Jennifer moved to Leakesville, Mississippi, about 50 miles northwest of Mobile. However, the place was special to her, and she inherited the home and the property when her grandparents passed. Jennifer was generous with her space. In November of 2021, she let the nearby fairgrounds use some of her open land for parking during a Morgan Wallen concert. In January of 2022, she had planned to rent the home out to an Alabama man. However, over the next weekend of January 27, 2022, something unusual happened to Jennifer's home. An unknown person or group came onto the property without permission and knocked the historic home down. They hauled off much of the debris, leaving Jennifer with nothing but a small pile of material. A family member called her to ask what had happened, but this was the first Jennifer had heard about the fate of her home. Devastated, she told reporters that she cried for 2 days when she found out. Her potential renter said he had no idea what had happened to the home. He wanted to renovate it to start a business, and the family member who called her had no clues. Jennifer made the 1-hour drive to her property the following weekend and was horrified to see that her house had indeed been knocked down. There had been no permits or records filed with the city or the county, meaning there were no leads on who had initiated the demolition. She started by reporting the matter to the Mobile, Alabama Police Department. who issued her case a number. However, it took more than a month for her to get in contact with the department, and when she did, she was told it wasn't a police matter. Desperate for clues, in early March of 2022, Jennifer turned to the local news. She told reporters that she was prepared to offer a $1,000 reward for information about what had happened to her home. Jennifer also took matters into her own hands. She visited a local landfill to see if any debris ended up there. She was told by staff that an older brick structure had come through the weekend of January 27th, but they were unable to tell her who had brought the debris. Jennifer's news blast was successful. In April of 2022, a resident reached out after seeing her story on the news. The person had seen a construction company on the site in January, and they were able to give Jennifer the name. Jennifer passed the information on to the police, who were able to get in touch with the company. The owner reportedly confessed to demolishing the house, saying it was a mistake. Because there was no criminal intent, the company's owner was not arrested. Police have also declined to release the name of the organization. Faced with no other alternatives, Jennifer has decided to pursue her own legal case in civil court. Her attorney has recommended that she does not reveal the name of the company to the media while litigation is ongoing. However, Jennifer did tell the press, quote, "I'm not sure what kind of repayment they'll come up with. That house to me was priceless." Although the mystery has been solved, Jennifer has not had justice. The tragic crime meant the loss of an important family memory that she'll never be able to recover. In 1932, a Danish carpenter named Ole Kirk Christensen started making wooden toys. His company took off, and the following year, he started producing toys out of a new material, plastic. Ole's toy company was none other than the major manufacturer of colorful plastic bricks, Lego. Lego began producing their famous interlocking plastic bricks in 1949, and by 1971, the toys were best-selling among American children. As of 2018, the company had sold more than 75 billion bricks in 140 countries. Its products are carried by nearly every major toy retailer in the US, including Target and Walmart. In 2022, in the town of South Windsor, Connecticut, these retailers' Lego supplies were targeted. On October 21st, a man entered the Target at 125 Buckland Hills Drive and left with more than $1,700 worth of Lego sets. 5 days later, the same man did it again, making off with an additional $1,400 worth of Lego. But he wasn't done yet. 5 weeks later, on December 7th, the thief struck again at a Walmart store in the nearby town of Old Saybrook. This time, he wasn't alone. Along with 2 women, the man entered the store just before 8 a.m. and filled 2 carts with Legos. The group then walked out of the store without paying. When a loss prevention associate tried to stop them, the male criminal struck the worker with his elbow and then threatened to shoot him. The following day, Old Saybrook police had identified their suspect. The Lego thief who had plagued the area was a New Haven, Connecticut resident named Glenn London. However, police had no idea where Glenn might be, and it would take them months to track him down. On February 9, 2023, Glenn was finally taken into custody by the Connecticut police. On the same day, he was set a $10,000 criminal bond by the local courts. He's not revealed why exactly he targeted these toys specifically. At the last published reporting, he was held and charged with 2 counts of 4th-degree larceny. In the United States, NASCAR racing is a big business, and few races are bigger than the 36 races in the NASCAR Cup Series, 2 of which are hosted in Talladega on a track that bills itself as NASCAR's biggest and baddest. Opened in 1969, the Talladega Superspeedway sits on a stretch of land in Alabama that its own website calls suited for soybean farming. But the 2,000-acre site is host to a 2.66-mile tri-oval road racing course, where stock cars break speeds of more than 200 miles per hour at times. The fastest pole speed recorded on the track was an eye-watering 212 miles per hour in 1987. In the annual 500-mile Geico Cup, 39 cars compete to be the fastest. 40 years ago, in 1982, the race was called the Winston 500, and the track was called the Alabama International Motor Speedway. Much was different, but much was still the same. Competing in the race were some of the biggest names in NASCAR at the time: Dale Earnhardt Sr., Bobby Allison, Richard and Kyle Petty, and Bill Elliott. Among the 40 entrants, though, there was also an unknown upstart, a driver by the name of L.W. Wright, who was at the center of one of the most enduring mysteries in the sport's history. L.W. first rose to prominence in the spring of 1982, when a publicist working on his behalf contacted newspapers in Tennessee, pitching what ESPN has called a rags-to-riches racing tale. According to the publicist, L.W. was a 33-year-old short-track race car driver, with 42 starts in the lower-stakes NASCAR series called the Busch Grand National. L.W. reportedly also worked building touring buses and trucks for major country stars, including Waylon Jennings and Merle Haggard. Now, these two stars were going to help L.W. make it big by backing him in his NASCAR Cup Series debut at the Alabama International Motor Speedway in Talladega. Although L.W. claimed to have a local background racing in Virginia, actual NASCAR drivers were suspicious. L.W. borrowed nearly $40,000 from a Nashville marketing firm to purchase a car and transport it to Talladega. He bought a Chevrolet Monte Carlo from a local driver and Tennessean racing legend Cuckoo Marlin, on the condition that Cuckoo's son, Sterling, come with him to oversee pit stops and race strategy. L.W. also asked the Marlins to repaint the car from red to black and give it the number 34. Sterling, who would later go on to win 2 Daytona 500 races, was suspicious of L.W. from the beginning. He told ESPN in 2019 that L.W. said that he'd raced in Virginia but didn't know the names of any other Virginia drivers. Once he got to Talladega, Sterling said L.W. became even more suspicious to him, repeatedly asking questions that any real racer should already know. Once the newspaper stories came out, L.W. admitted that he hadn't participated in the Busch races, but rather in a series of smaller events that took place on the same racetrack. Still, he had already registered for the Winston 500, and he had qualified with a speed of 187 miles per hour. Former NASCAR executive Jim Hunter said that although the sanctioning body of the races was unsure about L.W., since he'd qualified and paid the entry fee, he was allowed to participate. L.W. was assigned a starting position of 36th place after the preliminary qualifiers. However, after just 13 laps of the required 188 to compete in the 500-mile race, L.W.'s NASCAR journey came to an undistinguished close. According to ESPN, once the green flag signaling the start of the race fell, the only move that L.W. Wright made was to get out of the way. He was unable to maintain the minimum race speed of 180 miles per hour, and he was ordered off the track. L.W. finished 39th of 40 cars. After the race, the mysterious driver simply vanished, leaving behind the brand new car and a series of bad checks that failed to clear. NASCAR was even said to have hired a private detective to track him down, but with no luck. L.W. became a legend in certain circles, a huckster who made it into racing's most illustrious events, scamming the entire system. Tennessee Sports Writers Hall of Fame member Larry Woody wrote of L.W. that, quote, if he could have driven as fast as he talked, L.W. Wright would be a NASCAR champion now. For 40 years, L.W.'s true identity remained a mystery. CBS Sports called him one of the most mysterious and dubious characters in the history of NASCAR. USA Insider compared him to D.B. Cooper, the plane hijacker who commandeered a flight in 1971, stole $200,000 in ransom money and parachuted away. Writers for Jalopnik theorized that it was a novelty thing for L.W., that he wanted to race a car and that it was easier and cheaper to con his way into doing so than building up the skills and experience to go legit. Then, in May of 2022, the unusual mystery was solved when L.W. himself decided to resurface, setting the record straight once and for all. Rick Houston, host of a NASCAR history-based podcast called The Scene Vault, undertook a year-long quest to find L.W. and persuade him to tell his story. In 2021, Rick was able to connect with Chris Wright via social media, who claimed that his elderly father, Larry, was the infamous LW. Over hundreds of direct messages, Chris switched between claiming that Larry would speak to Rick and protecting his father's identity. Rick was understandably skeptical. For decades, no one had been able to find LW, and he wasn't going to accept Larry's identity without proof. Finally, on December 14, 2021, Rick met with Chris Wright in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. At this meeting, Chris handed Rick what he called the Holy Grail, the original two-piece white racing suit worn by LW Wright at the Winston 500 Cup. The suit corresponded perfectly with the only known photo of LW. Chris insisted that Rick keep the suit and use it as proof of Larry's identity. But a meeting with the man himself was even more difficult to schedule than the meetings with his son. Chris told Rick that Larry had been hospitalized with COVID, and his health was fading. Although for decades he'd refused to speak to any members of the press, Chris said that his ill health was changing his father's mind. He told a skeptical Rick to await Larry's call. Months later, on April 16, 2022, an unknown number called Rick's cell phone. When he picked up, a voice on the other end of the line introduced himself. It was Larry Wright. Larry agreed to meet with Rick on April 20th. However, the meeting was to be a cloak and dagger operation. Rick wasn't given a direct address, but was instead told to go to a certain exit off of a local interstate, where Chris would be waiting to lead him to Larry. Rick wrote that the whole thing felt like a true crime drama, but he was eager to finally meet the man behind the enduring mystery of LW Wright, so he agreed. Over the course of a 2-hour conversation, Larry laid out his life story. Larry said that he had grown up in Virginia and dropped out of school in the 7th grade in order to help support his family. Larry claimed that he had joined the army and served as a Green Beret in Vietnam, but then later said that he never actually did. Larry told Rick that he was wanted by the FBI over back taxes, and that he entered the race to win the prize money. Another time he said that he was involved in a stolen safe crime and an arson incident at a Chevrolet dealership in Martinsville, Virginia. His story changed constantly, sometimes within minutes. Rick felt like he couldn't get a straight answer out of it. However, one thing seemed clear from photo evidence. Larry was definitely the racing legend known as LW Wright. Rick also noted that one of the most consistent parts of Larry's life story was what happened at Talladega. Larry told Rick that when he got to Talladega, he was blown away by the size of the biggest track in NASCAR. He imagined, quote, holding that pedal flat on the floor all the way around the track. That straightaway is almost a mile long, end quote. Larry turned to his brother and said, quote, Lord have mercy, ain't no way. Although he qualified for the race trials, he wasn't able to maintain enough speed and was black flagged after just 13 laps. Larry said he parked his car in the garage and ran. He claimed to have tried to qualify for another race in Nashville, but he couldn't. In 1983, Larry said the FBI apprehended him, but released him due to a lack of evidence. After this close call, he went on the run. Rick was unable to get a straight answer from Larry about where he went. Sometimes Larry even said that he went on to work as a mechanic for a driver in North Carolina, right under the NASCAR establishment's nose. In summary, although the identity of NASCAR's mystery driver has been revealed, there is still a lot of unanswered questions, and Larry himself might not even be able to answer them. Speaking with ESPN in 2022, Rick remarked, quote, my takeaway from this is that LW was seeking to finally get a burden off of his shoulders, to finally get his story out there. In the grand scheme of things, in the rearview mirror, what he did wasn't truly all that bad. Is there closure? I don't know. But to sit there and listen to him finally talk about it, to a lot of NASCAR fans, that's a day we thought would never come. In 2023, an unusual piece of evidence helped solve a true crime mystery more than a decade old. A sweet potato found at the scene of a Massachusetts attack brought a vigilante killer to justice. The shocking crime occurred on February 27, 2011. Todd Lampley, a Mississippi native, had moved to Massachusetts Cape Cod 9 years prior to make a life for himself and seek more opportunities. He was the father of 3 young daughters who he was raising with his girlfriend, Taisha Warren. On that fateful evening, Taisha cooked Todd a chicken and pasta dinner, which he was eating in his bedroom. At around 10 p.m., a single bullet was fired from outside the home at 42 Fresh Holes Road. It struck Todd in the back, knocking him into Taisha, who held him in her arms as he passed away. Police initially had few leads in Todd's case. They suspected it might be related to a murder trial in 2007 in which he had been implicated. However, Taisha said that she and Todd had both taken polygraph tests and had been cleared. She tearfully told a reporter for the Boston Globe, quote, "We had nothing to do with that. Our life moved on. I don't know truthfully if what happened has anything to do with that. All I know is that he died in my arms." Minimal evidence was recovered from the scene, just a few shell casings outside the bedroom window, and interestingly, a sweet potato. The potato was cut flat on one end, with a hole carved through the center. The other end of the vegetable was described as blown out and irregular. Investigators immediately suspected that the potato had been used as a silencing device to muffle the sound of the gunshot. A short distance from the windowsill, police also recovered a cell phone, which was thought to have belonged to the killer. The phone itself was registered in the name of Marlo Stanfield, the name of a fictional narcotics trafficker from the popular TV show The Wire. Interestingly, an episode of The Wire also featured a sweet potato being used as a silencer. The cell phone connection made it likely that Todd's attacker was inspired by the crime show. Just a few days after the shooting, a known criminal by the name of DeVaris Hampton was brought into the local police department on an unrelated crime. DeVaris, who had a long record, was asked by investigators if he knew anything about the murder of Todd Lampley. He refused to speak to them. However, DeVaris was wearing a GPS monitoring bracelet as part of his probation. Location records for the bracelet placed him in the area of Todd's house on February 27th. DeVaris was released, but he remained a suspect in Todd's case. However, there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. In mid-March of 2011, two civilians who were fishing in a nearby pond discovered a gun which had been discarded. They alerted police, who confirmed that the weapons matched the shell casing found outside of Todd Lampley's home. Investigators then turned to the GPS records from DeVaris' bracelet, where they found proof that he'd stopped nearby the pond on February 28th, the day before the shooting. The case against DeVaris was starting to build, but there was still no concrete evidence linking him to anything beyond being at the location of the crime. Police needed further proof. They were able to collect DNA from the sweet potato and generated a profile of the attacker, who was confirmed to be male. However, they didn't have any of DeVaris' DNA to compare it to, and no probable cause to obtain it from him. In 2016, 5 years after the attack, authorities were able to obtain DeVaris' DNA without his knowledge by collecting some of his phlegm that he spit into a puddle. Their tactics worked. A scientific examination revealed that the DNA from the sweet potato matched the DNA from DeVaris' spit. In 2023, DeVaris was finally arrested, and he's due to be arraigned in April. Prosecutors have not revealed why it took so long to arrest DeVaris after confirming the DNA match. However, they hope that bringing him to justice will bring some much-needed closure to Todd's family after all this time. Tim Brown lived in Love's Landing, a small neighborhood in Lake County, Florida, that's home to a thriving community of aviation enthusiasts, including pilots and engineers. Nearly everyone who lives there owns a plane, and the neighborhood is peppered with grass runways. Tim was no exception. His vehicle of choice was a Tecnam P2008, a two-seat aircraft with a single engine. In 2017, Tim and his wife, Dukhan Thivu, moved to Love's Landing after the affable Tim retired as a carpenter. Tim had always enjoyed the outdoors. He told neighbors that he'd been a scuba diver and fisherman when he was young, and had fallen in love with flying years earlier on a vacation in Alaska. Tim's neighbors loved him and his wife. They were outgoing and social. They regularly hosted dinner parties and talked about their love of travel and the outdoors. One neighbor told a reporter that they were, quote, one of the best liked couples in the air park. So it was a major shock to everyone in their lives when one morning in 2020, officers from more than half a dozen federal agencies arrived in Love's Landing to put Tim under arrest. His official crime was passport fraud. But when Tim was brought into custody, authorities made a shocking discovery. Tim hadn't just committed fraud. He was a longtime fugitive at the center of a national manhunt dating back decades. His real name was Howard Farley Jr. Howard was born in Nebraska in 1948. In school, he was well-liked and popular, with a bit of a roguish streak. He and his friends rode motorcycles to school and hosted keg parties on the weekend. When he got an after-school gig at a grocery store, he would treat his friends to free steaks, bagging them without ringing them up. He loved cars and once built an RV out of an old bus. Howard's first brush with the law was in 1965. Like other 16-year-olds, he was fond of cruising, driving up and down Omaha's main strip. Sometimes he and his friends would stage drag races. When police arrived on one occasion in September of 1965, Howard attempted to flee, driving away from the scene at more than 100 miles per hour. He was sentenced to a year of probation, and his date, who was injured in the police chase, later sued him for $25,000. After he graduated high school, Howard got a job working at the Burlington Northern Rail Yards. As an engineer, he drove trains from Lincoln, Nebraska to Sioux City and Creston, Iowa. He made good money, the equivalent of $160,000 today. He continued to party on the weekends with his old friends, and when he got an old girlfriend named Christine Schleiss pregnant, he married her. Their marriage was bumpy. Neither of them were happy about the arrangement, but in those days, Christina said it was just what you did if you were pregnant. She stayed at home with the baby while Howard hatched increasingly risky schemes with his friends. He took up skydiving. He may have even dabbled in a life of crime, and he was arrested in 1969 for burglarizing a local business. The charges were later reduced to accessory after the fact. By 1970, Howard was disenchanted with his marriage and his life in Nebraska. He filed for divorce and took a job with a railroad company based out of Alaska, leaving Christine and their daughter Amy behind. For the next decade and a half, he lived a transient lifestyle, working long hours and dividing his time between Alaska, Washington State, and Florida. He married again and got another divorce. He kept on partying. Friends described him as an adrenaline junkie. According to an anonymous source, sometime in the 1970s, someone introduced Howard to a man who was involved in the drug trade. The trafficker told Howard that he could make money just by bringing drugs with him as he traveled to Alaska, Washington, and Nebraska, and he jumped on the opportunity. Howard made so much money in the drug trade that he was able to quit his job with the railroad by the early 80s. He relocated to Lake Worth, Florida, on the beach just north of Miami, and decided to set out on his own, trafficking cocaine to his contacts in Nebraska and Alaska. By 1984, Howard was receiving payments of $80,000 to $100,000 on a semi-regular basis. He involved his family in his trade, including his sister Mary, and a number of high school friends, including several Vietnam veterans who had returned from overseas with drug addictions themselves. An anonymous source reported that they went to Howard's mother's house in the 1980s and saw bricks of cocaine piled for storage in the closet. The business was a success. Howard used his income to fund his life in Florida. He became a scuba diver and a fisherman, and regularly frequented a dive bar in Lake Worth called Harry's Banana Farm. He talked about buying a boat. In 1982, perhaps seeking some form of insurance against legal consequences, Howard filed an application for a Social Security number in the name of Timothy Terry Brown. Timothy was a child who passed away as an infant in 1955. However, in the days before networked records, it was easy for the illegitimacy of the request to be overlooked. Timothy's Social Security card was sent to Howard. Within just a few short years, he would have cause to use it. In August of 1983, police officers discovered cocaine at the home of a railroad worker named Juan Varga Manchego. Juan started naming names, revealing the vast network of drug transporters in the Lincoln area. More than 24 individuals were identified in Nebraska and Florida. At the top of the pyramid was Howard Farley. Investigators believed Howard was the kingpin of the group. Throughout 1984, they collected evidence, tracking Howard on multiple trips that he made to Lincoln, Nebraska. By early 1985, more than 70 people were implicated in the trafficking scheme. Authorities nicknamed the operation Southern Line. A series of indictments charged 74 people in a drug trafficking conspiracy across 5 states. At this time, it was the largest drug case in Nebraska history. On October 24, 1985, police and investigators from the FBI, the IRS, and the DEA made more than 50 arrests. Howard was not among them. He'd gotten wind of the impending charge, and he'd vanished without a trace. None of his known associates had seen him, and no one knew where they might have gone, not even Howard's own family. There was complete and total radio silence. Without the internet or cell phones, Nebraska law enforcement was forced to rely on traditional intelligence and surveillance to draw Howard out. A year later, he was briefly spotted by a DEA agent on the Caribbean island of St. Martin, but he was long gone by the time US agents arrived. In fact, Howard had left the Caribbean entirely, returning to South Florida despite being a fugitive. But he had a new identity. He was living full-time as Tim Brown and had completely stopped communicating with anyone from his old life. In 1985, Howard, going by Tim, met Giovana Fuda while she was vacationing in St. Martin. The pair struck up a romance, and in 1993, they were married. It was Howard's 3rd marriage, but Tim's first. Howard's mother and sister briefly risked a visit to Florida after the wedding, but this was the last time either would see him for more than 20 years. Howard told his wife that he had changed his name, but not that he was on the run. With Duke, Howard built a life as Tim Brown. Duke got a job working for Citibank, and together they enjoyed deep-sea fishing and diving. For 30 years, Tim Brown lived an adventurous, if quiet, life. In 2017, after he started having health issues, he moved into the home of Love's Landing. Howard Farley was an unfamiliar name left in the past. Tim would not even allow himself to think of it. Although Tim had left Howard behind, back in Nebraska, authorities had not. In 2009, investigators set up a trap. Howard's younger brother Ronald had passed away from lung cancer. Howard and Ronald were close growing up, and investigators thought he might reappear for Ronald's memorial, which was held on October 23rd, exactly 24 years after Howard was indicted. Several undercover officers were stationed at the event, and unmarked police cars were parked at the exits, but Howard didn't show. Investigators were left empty-handed once again. Perhaps more troubling, though, were fears that Howard wouldn't be prosecuted if he was captured. Deputy U.S. Marshal Will Iverson told reporters that charges against fugitive drug offenders are often dropped after 10 years, and for Howard, it had been 24. However, because he was perceived as the kingpin of a network, Howard's case remained a priority. It wasn't until 2014 that the charges were officially dropped. Howard, wherever he was a free man, and he was no longer a fugitive. But Howard, aka Tim Brown, had a problem. Identity theft is a crime, and when he applied for a passport renewal as Tim, alarms were sent at the US State Department. Thanks to new technology, the existence of a death certificate for Timothy Brown was flagged. Investigators knew that they had someone pretending to be someone else, they just didn't know who. On December 2nd, 2020, agents from dozens of departments arrived at Tim's home in Love Landing. They handcuffed him and took his fingerprints. Special Agent Kevin Grant remembered that Tim smiled, even looking down the barrel of an automatic machine gun. He seemed to know that the jig was up. Fingerprint records for Howard Farley, taken in 1969 in Nebraska, matched the prints of a man who claimed to be Tim Brown. Without knowing it, agents in Florida had netted what some have called Nebraska's white whale of fugitives. The decades-long manhunt was over. Because the charges against Howard had been dropped, none of his offenses in Nebraska were brought up at trial. However, the court charged him with identity theft, including obtaining a pilot's license under Tim's name, as well as passport fraud. The final indictment carried a maximum of 30 years in prison, but Howard, in poor health and now in his 70s, received a 4-year sentence. His wife and friends from Love Landing continued to stand by his side. Howard is currently incarcerated in Florida. He has less than 2 years' time left to serve before he'll walk out and resume Tim Brown's life. only this time he'll use his real name. 22-year-old Tani Len Kaposi and 34-year-old Jacob Bird were a happy young couple living in Illinois. By March of 1982, Tani was working at her father's insurance agency, and the two were looking forward to spending the rest of their lives together. Both Tani and Jacob had bright futures ahead of them. Unfortunately, these futures would be cut short on one tragic March evening. March of 2023 marks the 41st anniversary of this tragic crime, and their families are demanding justice. When Tani failed to show up for work on March 22, 1982, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Tani worked at her father's business and was known to be a dedicated and hard-working employee. Neither Tani's friends nor family had heard from her since the weekend, and as it turned out, nobody had heard from Jacob either. The police department was informed of the couple's disappearance, and the investigation began. Just a day later, on March 23, 1982, friends went to the home of Tani's mother, located in the 1500 block of Lincoln Place. As the friends entered the house, they found it eerily silent, and there were no signs of life. After checking all of the rooms, they came upon a final bedroom. When they opened the door, they found the bodies of Tani and Jacob. The two had been savagely attacked, and friends noticed that several items of jewelry belonging to Tani were missing. The police department arrived at the scene minutes later and began to process the scene. According to reports, investigators failed to find any signs of forced entry. It would later transpire that Beverly, Tani's mother, had moved to Florida and Tani continued living in her home. Beverly believes her daughter was an innocent bystander and the real target was Jacob Bird. There were rumors and whisperings around town that Jacob was involved in an illegal trade of substances. With the 41st anniversary fast approaching, the families of both victims are hoping to have some answers soon. Anyone with information is asked to contact 708-868-2500. 34-year-old Christa Luth had a deep passion and love for horticulture and botany. So much so that she obtained her undergraduate degree in botany, and by 2008 she was enrolled at Michigan State University, getting her second degree in horticulture. Christa also had attended St. Clair High School and St. Clair County Community College, where she was known as a bright and intelligent young woman. Christa had big dreams, and those that knew her knew she could achieve whatever she wanted. Sadly, she disappeared under mysterious circumstances before completing her second degree. In November of 2008, Christa broke off the relationship with her long-term boyfriend, 40-year-old Brad Cornaya. The pair had lived together on Eureka Street in Lansing, but Christa asked Brad to move out following the breakup. Christa was worried about how she would pay her rent, but was determined to make it work. On November 11, 2008, she left her apartment and headed for a greenhouse in Hunter Park as part of her university classes. Christa never made it to class and has never been seen or heard from again. Her university professors contacted her family after Christa failed to show up to class. Her family had also become worried during this time as they'd been unable to contact her. Sensing that something was wrong, her parents contacted the local police and reported their daughter missing. When the police arrived at Christa's apartment, they found her cat alone inside. They also found a pan of food on the stove and the lights had been left on. In the lead up to Christa's disappearance, she confided in her parents that Brad had been calling her incessantly, begging her to get back with him. On the day Christa disappeared, Brad was the last person to call her, and his truck was broken down on US 127. According to reports, investigators would find Christa's driver's license and phone close to where Brad's truck had broken down. Investigators believed that Brad was involved from the start, as he gave conflicting accounts and often lied about his movements on the day she disappeared. Brad Cornaya is a name that's very familiar to the police in Michigan, and according to Oxygen, his criminal record stems back to when he was 18 in 1985, when he was sentenced to 10 to 15 years for assaulting a woman after breaking into her home. In 2017, he was sentenced to serve 16 to 40 years for trafficking and using a computer to commit a crime. In January of 2021, the case took a shocking turn when the Michigan State Police charged Brad in connection with Christa's disappearance. The case against Brad Cornaya is ongoing, and as per the Michigan Department of Corrections records, he's currently being housed in the Carson City Correctional Facility. Christa Robin Luth is described as a white female with brown hair, blue eyes, 5'4" and 125 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact Sergeant Michael Dillon of the Michigan State Police Lansing Post at 517-322-1907, quoting case number 11439608. 21-year-old Tammy L. Fields was last seen by her roommates on January 12, 1987, in Kansas City, Missouri. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information available about Tammy. At around 1:40 p.m. on January 12th, she left her apartment in the 100 block of Topping Avenue and St. John's Avenue, telling her roommates that she was going to run some errands. Before she left, she told them that she would be back at around 4 p.m., but sadly, Tammy never returned. When evening fell, her roommates became worried. According to them, Tammy had a date planned at a local wrestling show that evening, and she never showed up for her date. On January 13, 1987, the day after she disappeared, she was due to travel to Pensacola, Florida. Tammy has never been seen or heard from again. Tammy's roommates contacted her family, who confirmed she'd never arrived in Pensacola. Tammy was reported missing, and the search for her was on. A few days after her disappearance, the police in Illinois performed a traffic stop and found something bizarre. A man who has never been named was in possession of Tammy's passport and vials filled with red liquid. Unfortunately, there's been little follow-up, and Tammy's disappearance remains a mystery. Tammy L. Fields is described as a white female with brown hair, green eyes, 5'4" and 125 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Kansas City Police Department at 816-234-5136, quoting case number 87042500. When 31-year-old Anita Kim Tilden failed to show up the hairdressers where she worked on July 10, 1987, her co-workers immediately contacted her family. Anita was known to be a sensible and dependable employee, and her missing work was extremely out of character. Anita's mother was horrified to learn that her daughter had failed to show up to work and immediately began calling her. There was no answer at Anita's Raytown, Missouri apartment, and following this, she was reported missing. According to Anita's mother, she'd spoken to her the night before, July 9th, over the phone. She told her mother that her allergies had flared up, causing her to feel unwell. The two said their goodbyes as Anita planned on getting some rest. This would become the last time she was ever seen or heard from again. The Raytown Police Department immediately began searching for Anita. When they searched her apartment, they discovered that she'd left behind her glasses and that there were unwashed pots in the sink. Everything in the apartment indicated that Anita had planned on coming back. So where was she? On July 20th, 1987, investigators discovered Anita's red and maroon 1987 Toyota Celica abandoned in the 9200 block of East 54th Street. The Charlie Project details that the car doors were locked, the battery was dead, and there was no sign of Anita or the car keys. It had also been noted that the car was parked in the wrong direction of oncoming traffic. There were little clues to work with, and the investigation quickly went cold. Anita and her husband, David Tilden, divorced in 1987, and she'd been looking after their child since then. It's not clear whether the ex-husband was ever a person of interest. Since 1987, Anita's case has run cold. If she were still alive today, she would be 67 years old. Anita Kim Tilden is described as a white female with black hair, hazel eyes, 5 foot to 5'1", and 98 to 102 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Raytown Police Department at 816-737-6020, quoting case number R7000048. In 1986, 52-year-old Alah Jane Grooms separated from her husband of 34 years, Donald Arthur Grooms. Ada had alleged that Donald was abusive towards her and had even obtained protection from abuse orders against him in the states of Pennsylvania and Maryland. According to reports, the divorce proceedings were long and complicated, and by 1988, the two were still not legally separated. Ada and Donald owned and operated Grooms Transit Company on Route 819 in East Huntington Township, Pennsylvania. Despite their messy, ongoing divorce proceedings and allegations of abuse, the two tried to keep their business afloat. On October 7, 1988, Ada started her day as usual, arriving at the transit co-office that morning to start her shift. At around 10 a.m., she asked one of the mechanics to check her vehicle as she believed something was wrong. Witnesses would later tell investigators that at around 10 a.m., Ada and the mechanic got into an argument about the inspection. Shortly before dinner, Ada left the company's headquarters and headed to her home just a few miles away in Scottsdale, Pennsylvania. After this, nobody knows what happened to Ada. When she failed to show up to her mother's birthday party on October 8th, she was reported missing to the Pennsylvania State Police. When the PSP arrived at Ada's home, they found her car parked on a side street close to her home, but there was no sign of her. Naturally, investigators wanted to speak with Donald, who told them he had been the last person to see Ada alive between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m. on the day she disappeared. According to Donald, he saw Ada leaving the home they once shared in a 30-foot mobile home. The mobile home was found abandoned a year later, in 1989, in Tampa, Florida. There was no sign of Ada with the vehicle, and she left everything behind at her home in Pennsylvania. Donald would later tell investigators that he believed Ada had run away to Arizona to join a cult, but no evidence has been uncovered to support this theory. Most people, including Ada's family, believe she met with foul play, possibly at the transport headquarters she co-owned with her estranged husband. If still alive today, Ada would be 88 years old. She's described as a white female with blonde hair, blue eyes, 5'7" and 150 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact Trooper Brian Zimmerman of the Pennsylvania State Police at 724-832-3288, quoting case number A1559330. Renting out a room in your home can be a good way to earn some extra money. It can also lead you to meeting some disturbing and creepy people, as Oakley Llite discovered in May of 2004. For 18 years, this creepy unsolved case has stumped investigators. Al was a 53-year-old man living in Aurora, Colorado when the crime took place. He worked for an engineering consulting firm and had recently held some high-ranking positions in another company. He was very successful with what he did and liked by his coworkers. On the morning of May 24th, 2004, his absence was noticed by his coworkers. It wasn't like Al to not show up, especially without calling to let someone know. They tried to get a hold of him through his cell phone and house phone, but got no response. After multiple calls, they tried Al's emergency contact, his sister. She was also unable to get in contact with him and phoned the police. The police visited Al's home, a 2-story townhouse with the basement set up as a separate unit. Al was found in the basement, no longer alive. It was immediately clear this wasn't an accident. It was a brutal attack that seemed to have lasted many hours. The last person to talk to Al before this creepy crime took place was his girlfriend, Linda. Linda and Al had been dating for a few months at the time. On May 22nd, Al dropped her off at the airport for a week-long trip. She called him once she landed at 3:30 p.m., and the two chatted about their dates. Al had just finished fixing a pipe in the basement. A new tenant was scheduled to move in any day now. Linda had only met him once, and he'd made sure that she didn't get a look at his face. It seemed the only person who had gotten a look at the mysterious tenant was Al himself. When the call ended, Linda had no idea that would be the last time anybody spoke to Al. Police believed he'd passed away hours after the phone call. The house, other than the basement, was spotless. The bladed instruments that had been used in the attack against Al were found in the kitchen sink, which was filled with bleach. Also in the sink were Al's car keys. Al's car, phone, and wallet were missing from the house. The car would be found shortly afterward, but it only provided more puzzles in this already strange case. Inside was an ATM receipt. The criminal had used Al's card to take out $1,000, far less than Al had in his bank account. CCTV from the ATM showed the criminal driving Al's vehicle and wearing a ski mask. The mysterious tenant became a focus for investigators. All the information on his forms was fake, including the alias Robert Cooper. His cell phone was a burner phone. Both Cooper's phone and Al's were later located. They'd been dumped in an area with a large homeless population and had been used by unknowing homeless people. It would emerge Cooper had tried to rent from a number of people in the area. Each time, he changed a little. Sometimes he had a Romanian accent. Sometimes he spoke with an American accent. Sometimes he had a limp and walked with a cane. But the mysterious Cooper was believed to be the same person. A small amount of DNA evidence was found at the crime scene, but has never been matched in any database. There are many theories about who Cooper could have been, with everything from an assassin doing a trial run to someone who just wanted the thrill of taking a life. No actual suspects have ever been identified. The early hours of the morning of September 14, 2020, tragedy was narrowly averted when cable cars on Squamish's sea-to-sky gondola came crashing down. It was the second time in just over a year that the gondola had been sabotaged. Neither creepy crime has ever been solved. The Sea-to-Sky Gondola is a major tourist attraction just south of Squamish, British Columbia. It gives tourists a 10-minute trip up the mountainside near Squamish Chief. It's a major employer in the area and attracts customers for other business. So when it came crashing down into the mountainside on August 10, 2019, it was a major incident. It was about 4 a.m. when campers in the area were awoken by the loud noise of the cars crashing into the mountainside. The company running the gondola was certain that a crime had taken place. They had recently done maintenance checks on the cables, and it seemed impossible that they had suddenly snapped by themselves. An investigation confirmed that the cables had been deliberately cut. These were heavy-duty cables made up of 6 bundles of wires designed to withstand forces more than 7 times the force of a Boeing 747 airplane. Police closed trails beneath the gondola. It was believed that the culprit would have hiked up one of these trails to go to a maintenance pole. They then would have climbed up the pole and cut the cable with heavy-duty wire cutters. The gondola itself wasn't operating at the time, but that didn't mean this disturbing crime wasn't dangerous. As well as the risk to the criminal themselves, there were campers in the area who could have been unlucky enough to be beneath the cars when they fell. Thankfully, nobody was hurt. After millions of dollars and roughly 6 months, the gondola was repaired and operating again. That stopped on September 14th. It was again 4 a.m. when the crime took place. A security guard was on site and had been alerted that there was something wrong in the area. An automatic alarm may have been triggered. CCTV footage from the crime scene showed the guard with a flashlight walking beneath the gondola. Suddenly, the wires began to shake, and there were flashing lights in the distance. The lights are believed to be the cars colliding with the mountain again. Luckily, the guard was unharmed. Another investigation began, and again, it was found that the wires had been deliberately cut. Security camera footage was partially obscured by wildfire smoke coming north from the US. But police released a thermal imaging camera photo of the criminal. The criminal responsible is believed to be physically fit and have good knowledge of the gondola and the surrounding area. More than 70 people of interest have been interviewed but ruled out. A reward of $500,000 is offered for information that can solve this creepy crime. A special police gondola information line can be reached at 1604-892-6122. The Meraluma bank robbery was the largest bank robbery in Australian history and remains unsolved to this day. What makes this crime so creepy is just how skilled the robbers were, but they left no trace that would ever identify them. The robbery was discovered on the morning of November 24, 1978. Security guards arriving at work at the Bank of New South Wales in the sleepy town of Meraluma noticed that the rear door was open. It was the first sign that something very wrong had happened overnight. Once inside, they discovered the vault door closed and damaged in such a way that it could not be opened. It took council workers with jackhammers, sledgehammers, and other cutting equipment to get the vault door open. 9 hours after the security guards first noticed that something disturbing had happened overnight, the vault was finally opened. The police chief announced to those gathered that they had taken everything. The lot was almost $2 million in 1978 money. Despite Meraluma being a small, quiet town, the bank was the largest in the area. Every 2 weeks, armored trucks would bring cash from other areas into the bank. It was cash from the government to meet pensions and wages in the area, and now it was all gone. The criminals had been very precise. After picking the lock at the back of the bank, they had used electromagnetic diamond-tipped drills to get into the safe. If they were just a fraction of a millimeter off with the tool, they would trigger the alarms. After getting the cash, the criminals jammed the safe by removing the combination lock dials and safe handles. This not only gave them added time, but it's also possible that valuable evidence was destroyed as investigators tried to break their way into the safe. A $250,000 reward was announced for information that would crack the case, but it was never claimed. Attention fell on Graham Kennyberg, a safe cracker and the leader of the magnetic drill gang. It seemed to be their work, but no evidence was ever found to confirm that. Others believed that it had been an inside job. Only someone working at the bank would know how much money was inside that night. In 2022, career criminal Robert Bertram Kidd claimed in his memoirs to be the mastermind behind the theft. He was in prison at the time, but the robbery had allegedly been planned for 3 months, and a team following his instructions committed the act. He didn't provide any information about the theft that wasn't already public knowledge, though, and the case officially remains unsolved. The disappearance and passing of Judy Smith in 1997 is one of the strangest unsolved true crime mysteries. Judy disappeared from Philadelphia, only for her body to turn up 5 months later in Asheville, North Carolina. Judy was a newly married 50-year-old woman living in Boston with her new husband, Jeff. She had been married twice before and had children from a previous marriage, but at this point, she was certain Jeff would be the one. Jeff was an attorney who had met Judy when she worked as a carer for his father. In April of 1997, 5 months after they married, Judy and Jeff traveled to Philadelphia for a weekend trip. Jeff had a pharmaceuticals conference that he needed to attend, and Judy was going to spend some time sightseeing. The trip got off to a bad start when the couple arrived at the airport and Judy realized she had forgotten her ID. After a discussion, they agreed Jeff would get on the scheduled flight and Judy would get a later flight after getting her ID. Judy arrived at the hotel later that evening and the couple were reunited. The next day, Judy left for her sightseeing trip at 9 a.m. while Jeff headed to his conference. They had agreed to meet back up at 5:30 p.m. to have dinner together, but when Jeff returned to the hotel room, Judy was nowhere to be seen. He waited for a while, but when there was no sign of Judy after half an hour, he began to search for her. Jeff started to investigate the mystery by taking a taxi along the route of Judy's sightseeing bus, hoping to see her. When that didn't work, he contacted the police. Police found no trace of Judy in Philadelphia. Some even remarked that there were very few items belonging to Judy in the hotel room, and it almost seemed as if she'd never been there at all. Jeff was considered a suspect in her mysterious disappearance, but he had been at the conference all day. He was also overweight and had health issues, and it seemed unlikely he would have been able to attack her. There were multiple sightings across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, with many witnesses claiming Judy was acting strangely and seemed disoriented. It seemed as if she might have had a mental health breakdown, but the creepy case was turned on its head 5 months later. On September 7th, a father and son were hiking in a remote area near Asheville, North Carolina, and came across human remains. It seemed the body had been buried in a shallow grave at one point, but had been uncovered due to scavengers. Dental records identified the remains as belonging to Judy. She'd been struck with a bladed object. Police believed her attacker had committed the crime near where Judy was found. She hadn't been transported there after the fact. Judy wasn't wearing the same clothes that she was wearing when she vanished. In fact, she was wearing hiking gear that seemed to be newly bought. Witnesses in Asheville remembered seeing Judy from Boston and said that she didn't seem to be acting strangely at all. Police believed Judy had chosen to come to Asheville of her own accord for unknown reasons, and in a tragic coincidence had met with foul play there. Jeff passed away without ever getting the answers as to what happened to his wife, and the strange case remains unsolved. In 2010, the CEO of a German bank received a call from his wife. She had been kidnapped, and if he didn't send 300,000 pounds to the kidnapper, she would lose her life. Even when Thomas Boogur followed the kidnapper's instructions, his wife was never released. It was May 12th of 2010 when this creepy unsolved case began. Thomas and his wife Maria lived in Germany. They apparently had a happy marriage and had 2 adult children who didn't live with them. That morning started like any other. Thomas left for his job at a bank, leaving Maria home alone. At some point around 11:30 a.m., an unidentified individual or individuals broke into the house and kidnapped Maria. She was handcuffed and forced into her own car. An hour later, Thomas received a call from the kidnappers. The person on the phone was judged to be middle-aged. He wanted 300,000 euros and a variety of notes. The money was to be left at the side of the A7 and marked with a German flag, and it needed to be done quickly. Thomas only had a few hours to go through with the demand. He was permitted to speak with his wife. Maria told him that they'd threatened her life and that he needed to do what they said. Thomas contacted the police straight away, but also got to work getting the money together. Unfortunately, that took longer than expected, and it wasn't until 7:30 p.m. that the money was left at the side of the road in a black trash bag as instructed. Nobody came for the money. Thomas never heard from the perpetrators after this disturbing crime. Days passed, and the Boogur family made a public appeal for the criminals to release Maria. A reward for information was also announced. The crime prompted a massive search effort, with 500 police officers and 100 police dogs combing through wooded areas around the site where the money had been dropped off. Dive teams and thermal imaging cameras were also used. 3 weeks after Maria vanished, a man walking his dog discovered a woman's body about a kilometer away from the drop-off point. She lay under a pile of brushwood not far from the path. The woman was identified as Maria. It seemed she'd been struck with a bladed object, and police estimated she'd passed away not long after the phone call with Thomas. It was likely she was no longer alive when the money was dropped off. In the decade since the disturbing crime took place, police have been unable to identify the criminals responsible. In 2017, a man was arrested after he boasted about committing the crime while drunk, but there was no evidence to link him to the crime, and he was released. The case is one of the most puzzling unsolved true crime cases in modern German history. 53-year-old Ben Novak Jr. and 86-year-old Bernice Novak sat at the helm of an empire. The late Ben Novak Sr., the father of Ben Jr. and husband of Bernice, founded and built the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, Florida. As a result, the family enjoyed a life of luxury and never needed or wanted anything. Ben Jr.'s wife, Narcy Novak, and her children were also treated by the spoils of the empire. In 2009, business was booming, and the only way was up for the Novaks. That was until April, when Bernice suffered a tragic accident that would set in motion one of the most bizarre plot twists in true crime history. On April 5th, 2009, the body of 86-year-old Bernice Novak was found in the laundry room of her home at 2737 Northeast 37th Street in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Bernice's family was devastated by her passing. Despite her numerous injuries, including broken teeth and a cracked skull, the coroner ruled that Bernice had tripped and fallen, causing her passing. Her family were unhappy with the ruling, but there was little that they could do. Months later, on July 12, 2009, tragedy would strike the Novak family once more. This time, it was 53-year-old Ben Jr. Ben was found in his hotel room in Rye Brook, New York, just hours before he was due to host a convention at the Hilton Rye Brook Hotel. Like his mother, Ben had been badly beaten, and his attackers had stepped it up a notch. He had been restrained while the assault occurred, leaving him defenseless. Investigators began to pay attention to the case. It seemed like an odd coincidence that two people from a very wealthy family would be attacked within just months of each other. Investigators took another look at Bernice's case and realized that it wasn't a tragic accident after all. That's when suspicions turned to Narcy Novak, the wife of Ben Jr. Narcy was in line to receive a cut of her husband's $4.2 million estate, along with some of the generational wealth of his family. At first, Narcy denied any involvement, playing the role of a grieving wife, but her house of cards quickly collapsed. Luckily, investigators caught on to Narcy's plan and discovered evidence that she'd paid Alejandro Garcia, Dennis Ramirez, and Joel Gonzalez to take out Ben Jr. and Bernice. At first, the plan was for the two hitmen to give Bernice a beating, but the event quickly escalated. Narcy knew that she needed her husband out of the picture to get control of his finances, so she paid Garcia and Gonzalez $18,500 to get the job done. Narcy, her brother, Cristobal Veliz, Alejandro Garcia, Joel Gonzalez, and Dennis Ramirez were all arrested in connection with the case. Narcy and her brother received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, while the other men negotiated lesser sentences in exchange for information. On the morning of August 4th, 1981, the father of 34-year-old Sylvia Quayle headed to her home in the 3800 block of South Ogden Street in Cherry Hills, Denver. Cherry Hills is described as a wealthy suburb of Denver and is considered a safe and peaceful place to live. This notion would change on August 4th when Sylvia's father opened the door and discovered his daughter's body on the floor. She had been viciously attacked and physically assaulted. Her attacker had stripped her of her clothes, leaving just a t-shirt over her face once he was done. Sylvia's father called 911, summoning paramedics to the scene, but it was too late. The Cherry Hills Police Department also responded to the scene and began their investigation. The crime scene was like nothing they'd seen before, and those who witnessed it, including Sylvia's father, were never the same. In 1981, forensic technologies were limited, and the Cherry Hill Police Department used every resource at its disposal. Unfortunately, the attacker left little evidence behind, and Sylvia's case went cold. In 2000, the Cherry Hills Police Department partnered with the Colorado Bureau of Investigations and developed a male DNA profile from evidence on Sylvia and at the scene. This sample was submitted to CODIS, but no matches were made. 20 years later, the Cherry Hills Police Department partnered with the United Data Connect Company, which provides genetic genealogical services. This time, the DNA was run through public databases Family Tree DNA and GED Match. According to detectives, this search yielded over 3,000 possible suspects. Genealogists and detectives worked side by side to eliminate people until they reached one name: David Dwayne Anderson. David was in the area when the crime occurred, and he had a criminal record. David now resided in Nebraska, but Cherry Hill investigators worked with the local authorities and a trash pull was performed. Investigators sifted through multiple bags of trash from David's property. Inside one of these bags, they found a can of vanilla Coke. This was seized into evidence, and weeks later, there was a breakthrough. Forensic scientists were able to obtain and sequence a DNA profile from the can of vanilla Coke, and their analysis confirmed that David Dwayne Anderson's DNA matched the DNA found on Sylvia and at the crime scene. In early 2021, David was arrested and charged in Sylvia's case. On August 4th, David Dwayne Anderson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after a jury found him guilty on 2 counts. In 2011, 41-year-old Christine Metter and her estranged husband, David Metter, were embroiled in a bitter custody dispute. David had already obtained custody of one of their 4 daughters and hoped to do the same with the others over the coming months. This enraged Christine, who believed she should have their daughter's sole custody. There were allegations on both sides, with David stating that one of his daughters refused to get on a plane with Christine and had missed a lot of schooling due to the stress. Christine, on the other hand, accused David of being abusive throughout their marriage. Custody hearings came and went, and it appeared that the courts were going to side with David again, which further angered Christine. One evening, she talked to an old friend on Facebook, Patrick Sabo, about her woes and how much she hated David. Patrick made a remark saying that Christine should hire someone to take care of David. While Patrick's remark was supposed to be lighthearted, Christine took his words seriously. Days later, Patrick received another message from Christine, in which she offered him $3,000 to find a hitman to take care of David. Christine's father, Al Zambore, was also enthusiastic about David being out of the picture. Christine picked Patrick as he had once served in the army. Patrick was both terrified and confused. Instead of speaking to an old military friend about getting the job done, he went straight to the Eastlake Police Department in Eastlake, Ohio. After recounting the bizarre story, the Eastlake officers agreed to something strange. Two of their officers went undercover and posed as hitmen. They found David, who was now living in Atlanta, Georgia, and asked him to play along. The officers took photos of David lying on the ground and photoshopped in wounds. On June 3, 2011, the officers arrived back in Eastlake, Ohio with the good news. They told Christine that David was gone. Christine and her father Al were elated. David had a $1.5 million life insurance policy that would be paid out to her. The officers, posing as hitmen, requested just $100,000 for their work. Just moments after agreeing to pay the fake hitmen, other Eastlake police officers swarmed in and arrested Christine and Al. According to reports, 77-year-old Al passed away while in custody. In 2012, Christine was sentenced to serve just 10 years for trying to hire a hitman to take out her husband. The sentence appalled many in the Eastlake community, and there were cries to keep her behind bars for longer. David Metter has since remarried and now has custody of his 4 daughters. During her trial, Christine claimed that her father had manipulated her. As per the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, it appears that Christine was released in March of 2021 and is currently under Adult Parole Authority supervision until 2026. Blanch Taylor Moore of Concord, North Carolina, was considered a kind and gentle woman. But this gentle-looking woman was hiding a dark secret. In 1962, Blanch began seeing someone else behind her husband, James Taylor's back. The object of the affair was Raymond Reed, the supermarket manager where she worked. In 1973, Taylor mysteriously passed away, and Blanch was free to continue her relationship with Raymond. Nobody questioned James's passing, which was believed to have been natural causes. Months after her husband passed, Blanch introduced her family to Raymond, and the two made their relationship public. For several years, the relationship was good, but Blanch wasn't happy having just one partner. She began to grow close to Pastor Reverend Dwight Moore, and Blanch masqueraded their meetings as Bible studies or discussions with God. During the 1980s, Raymond's career was going from strength to strength, and as a result, he moved around North Carolina while Blanch stayed put. To the outside world and Raymond, it appeared that the relationship was nothing short of perfect. But just hours after 1986 rang in, something bizarre would happen. Raymond suffered from what appeared to be food poisoning over the New Year's celebrations. At first, Raymond waved it off as a bad dinner, but the symptoms plagued him for weeks. Many doctors and specialists were called to attend to Raymond, with one doctor diagnosing him with a disorder where his immune system attacks his nervous system, causing muscle weakness and breathing difficulties. Blanch remained at her husband's side, feeding him small bites to eat and giving him his medication. But Raymond became sicker and sicker. Blanch rushed Raymond to the Baptist hospital one afternoon after his condition had deteriorated. On October 7, 1986, 50-year-old Raymond Reed passed away. Blanch wasted no time moving on to her next boyfriend, Reverend Dwight Moore. The relationship between the two was intense, and just 3 years after Raymond passed away, Blanch Taylor married Reverend Moore. Days after the two had tied the knot, Dwight began experiencing strange symptoms. Like Raymond, he was battling sickness, nausea, and other food poisoning-related symptoms. Dwight later recalled that his illness came on shortly after Blanch fed him a chicken sandwich. Dwight's condition did not improve, and he was whisked away to the North Carolina Memorial Hospital for treatment. Doctors felt something wasn't right with Dwight and ordered a round of blood tests just to be sure. What they discovered would shock them. 2 to 5 weeks before his admission, doctors found that Dwight had over 100 parts per million of arsenic in his bloodstream, well over 100 times the normal recommended exposure limit. All the symptoms he and Raymond had suffered mirrored those of arsenic poisoning, such as abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, chest pain, shortness of breath, pins and needles, and burning sensations in extremities. The doctors were not sure that Dwight would survive, given how much arsenic he had in his system, and immediately called the police. Dwight, still hooked up to machines to help him breathe and live, gave an interview with the police that would uncover one of North Carolina's most shocking crimes. Investigators realized that in the cases of Raymond and Dwight, there was one common denominator: Blanch Taylor Moore. Raymond and her first husband, James Taylor, were exhumed, and investigators found large levels of arsenic in their bodies. At this point, they realized that James Taylor hadn't passed due to a heart attack. He had been poisoned. The certificates for James and Raymond were changed, and Blanch was under investigation. By July of 1989, Blanch Taylor Moore was in custody awaiting trial. On November 16, 1990, Blanch was found guilty on multiple counts, including taking the lives of 2 of her husbands and trying to get rid of a third. The North Carolina courts handed down a sentence of capital punishment, and Blanch's automatic appeals mean that an execution date has not yet been set. She's now 90 years old, making her the oldest woman ever on death row. In 2019, Jussie Smollett was having a hard time breaking through the barriers of the entertainment industry. He had starred in the hit show Empire, but by 2019, he discovered that there were no plans for his character to continue appearing in the show. Jussie took some time to recuperate and decided what his next steps were. Unfortunately, tragedy struck before Jussie could get booked for his next big-time gig. On January 29, 2019, at around 2 a.m., Jussie was outside his Chicago apartment when 2 men approached him. They began attacking him, throwing chemicals in his face and hurling racial slurs. Jussie survived the attack and was immediately transported to the hospital. When news broke of the attack on Jussie, the entertainment industry and celebrities rallied behind him, offering him what he described as an outpouring of support. Jussie was released from the hospital on January 30th, 2019, and the world watched as the Chicago Police Department began its investigation. There was immense pressure on the Chicago Police Department to apprehend Jussie's attackers as quickly as possible. Many saw how society was shifting and took this as a sign of worse things to come. A month later, the Chicago Police Department shocked the world when they announced that they had arrested Jussie Smollett, the victim. Jussie was arrested for filing a false police report after evidence surfaced that showed Jussie had paid 2 men $3,500 to attack him. CCTV footage showed the 2 would-be attackers buying masks and other items used in the attack that evening. What followed were long and complicated legal proceedings. At first, Jussie was acquitted, but by 2021, new charges against Jussie were filed. At his trial, Jussie was found guilty of 5 counts of disorderly conduct. Despite the evidence against him, Jussie has continued to maintain his evidence. When the charges against him were first filed, the world was stunned. The victim had now turned out to be the perpetrator. In 2022, Jussie Smollett was sentenced to 150 days in prison in order to pay $145,000, mostly to cover the cost of the resources used by the Chicago PD. He's also subjected to 30 months of probation. 18-year-old Giovana Fuda was described as your typical teenager. She had just graduated from high school in Maple Valley, Seattle, and was looking forward to the future. Gia's parents described her as determined and inquisitive, often leading her to sneak out on her own adventures. In July of 2020, an impromptu trip would spiral out of control, sending Gia's parents and the authorities on a manhunt, trapped in a race against time. July 24th, 2020 started like any other day for the Fuda family. Bob and Kristen, Gia's parents, went to work kissing their daughter goodbye. Before leaving, they discussed plans for the day with Gia, who wanted to get out and about. Gia told her parents that she was hunting for a coffee shop and intended to make the 18-mile drive to North Bend, Seattle. Gia was responsible and cautious, and her parents had no concerns. That morning, Gia set out in her car for North Bend. Investigators later uncovered CCTV footage of Gia at a coffee shop in Index. After visiting this coffee shop, Gia returned to her car and continued driving northeast for unknown reasons. As the sun set, Gia's parents became concerned. She'd failed to return home and wasn't answering her phone. In the early morning hours, Gia was reported missing to the King County Sheriff's Office. The search for Gia began hours later, with officers scouring every inch of Highway 24. Dozens of potential witnesses were interviewed, but nobody had seen Gia after she left the coffee shop in Index. Investigators struggled to track her phone signal, and people began to believe the worst. 3 days after Gia disappeared, her car was found on a highway that traveled through the infamous Cascade Mountains. Her personal belongings were missing, including her bag, phone, and Bible. The car had been parked at an awkward angle and ran out of gas. Investigators considered the scene suspicious, and the approach to Gia's case changed. Officers now feared that Gia had been abducted or harmed. According to search and rescue officers, the area where Gia's car was found was considered a signal black spot, making it impossible to track Gia's phone. The search intensified in the days after Gia's car was discovered, and her family braced themselves for the terrible news. Then, on August 1st, 2020, Gia's case would take a shocking turn. Search and rescue officers near Scenic Creek found a notebook that belonged to Gia. According to the Daily Mail, the searchers followed the creek, finding more items along the way. As they continued searching along the creek, they spotted a woman between the trees. It was Gia. Investigators rejoiced at the news that Gia had been found alive and well. She told officers that her car had run out of gas and she decided to walk through the forest to find a bridge that led to Skykomish. Unfortunately, Gia lost her bearings and became trapped in the forest. For 8 days, she survived on creek water and berries. She spent her time reading her Bible and trying to find her way out of the wilderness. Gia was reunited with her family the following day and has gone on to make a full recovery. On April 7, 2023, the Marion County Sheriff's Office received a bizarre call from a fisherman fishing at Lake O'Pines in Marion County, Texas. In the call, the fisherman explained that he was on the south side of the lake and could see a large black object submerged in the water. Around 20 minutes later, the Marion County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene. What they would discover would continue to baffle them for years. When officers arrived, they believed they were dealing with a simple submerged object. As they got closer, they noticed that the object was, in fact, a black Jeep that was 40 feet from the shore. Officers called for backup and a tow truck and waited for help. The fisherman lent a helping hand and told officers he would stay at the scene and use his boat. When the fisherman paddled closer to the boat, he was shocked at what he saw. Inside the Jeep was a woman, and she was alive. The fisherman's calm demeanor changed, and he stressed the situation's urgency to officers at the scene. Incredibly, with the help of the Marion County Sheriff's Office and the fisherman, the Jeep was finally towed to safety after many hours of effort. This all took place while the woman was trapped inside. The woman, whose name has not been released, was taken to a nearby hospital. After searching her name, officers discovered yet another bombshell. The woman, who we'll call Mrs. X, was listed as a missing person by the Longview, Texas Police Department. According to her report, she'd been missing for 2 days when she was rescued. Somehow, the woman had ended up in the lake 24 miles from her home in Longview. No further details have been released, although it is believed that she may have been trapped for upwards of 24 hours. Tanya and Tom Ryder of Maple Valley, Washington, were working towards a big goal. The two had been together for several years, and now they were ready to buy a house and start a new chapter of their lives. Tom and Tanya worked 2 jobs to make their dreams a reality, and the savings quickly began adding up. In September of 2007, Tom and Tanya were close to reaching their goal when Tanya mysteriously disappeared. On September 20th, 2007, Tanya left the Fred Meyer supermarket in Maple Valley and headed home. Tanya worked the night shift at Fred Meyer while working at Nordstrom during the day. Working 2 jobs was incredibly tiring, and Tanya already began to feel the strain on her physical and mental health. That evening, Tanya had planned on getting a few hours of sleep before she had to be back up for her other job, but Tanya never made it home. That morning, Tanya failed to attend her second job, and her colleagues became concerned. When the pattern of absences continued between her two jobs, her colleagues called her husband Tom. Like Tanya, Tom worked long hours between two jobs, and the couple rarely saw each other. Tom had no idea that his wife had failed to return home that evening due to his hectic schedule. On September 22, 2007, 2 days after she was last seen, Tanya was reported missing by her husband to the King County Sheriff's Office. At first, the report was not taken seriously, and Tom and his family were forced to put together their own search. Over the following days, Tom pleaded with the King County Sheriff's Office to take his wife's case seriously. He even volunteered to take a lie detector test and told investigators that they could search his home freely. Almost a week after Tanya disappeared, the King County Sheriff's Office finally took her disappearance seriously. In the initial days of her disappearance, Tom asked them to track her phone, but they declined. When the disappearance was finally taken seriously, the King County Sheriff's Office tracked Tanya's phone to Highway 169 near Renton, Washington. Search crews were sent out into the area to look for any sign of Tanya. Her friends and family feared the worst, as she'd been missing for over a week, but the King County Sheriff's Office persisted. Using phone data and location pings, officers found Tanya's Honda Element stuck upside down in a ravine near Highway 169. As they neared the car, they shouted for backup. Tanya was alive. Tanya explained that she had no memories after leaving Fred Meyer and somehow ended up in a ravine. Investigators believe she fell asleep at the wheel due to severe exhaustion, and her car had flipped and become lodged in the ravine. Tanya suffered a broken collarbone, a dislocated shoulder, kidney damage, and extensive damage to her leg during the incident. Thankfully, Tanya was pulled from the wreckage and was transported to the nearest hospital. She told investigators while she was trapped upside down in her car, she desperately tried to reach for her phone. She watched as her husband's calls came through, but she was unable to reach her phone to answer. In the wake of her ordeal, Tanya wrote a book titled Missing Without a Trace: 8 Days of Horror. Michelle Whitaker of Spartanburg, South Carolina, was working towards getting her life together. She'd recently gone through a rough patch and wound up in jail for driving under the influence. Michelle served her time, and her family was excited to have her home. In August of 2002, Michelle was released from jail, pending a place at a rehabilitation center. But before Michelle made it to the center, she would mysteriously disappear. Spartanburg authorities had bungled Michelle's release. Due to a communication error, Michelle was released back onto the streets instead of being sent to a treatment center. In early August of 2002, Michelle was witnessed walking along I-85, and she was clearly under the influence of alcohol. She was again arrested and freed due to an error. Michelle's mother was happy to have her daughter home, but the bliss didn't last. The two got into an argument, leading Michelle to storm out of the house. According to reports, Michelle was last seen sometime around August 16, 2002. Witnesses recalled seeing Michelle at the Truck Stops of America along I-85 in Spartanburg, South Carolina. When the Spartanburg authorities realized their error, it was too late. Michelle was missing. Michelle's family hadn't heard from her in several days and became concerned. She was subsequently reported missing. The friend who dropped Michelle off at the truck stop was interviewed, but nothing came of this. Truckers at the stop came forward to investigators, claiming to have seen Michelle when she disappeared. According to the truckers, Michelle was trying to hitch a ride to Myrtle Beach, but whether Michelle got into a truck is unknown. Investigators continued their search for Michelle, but few traces were left behind. Months after Michelle disappeared, 21-year-old Heather Sellers disappeared. Michelle and Heather had worked together, and investigators were eyeing Heather's boyfriend, Jonathan Vick, as a suspect. Investigators began to ponder whether Jonathan could have been involved in Michelle's bizarre disappearance. 3 years after Michelle disappeared, the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office received an ominous letter. The anonymous letter stated that investigators could find Michelle's body in Landrum, South Carolina, close to a pond. The area was searched, but no sign of Michelle was ever found. Michelle's family continued to fight for justice and answers. They were stuck between two theories. Michelle had run away to Myrtle Beach, or somebody had taken her life. In 2008, authorities in Oregon received a bizarre call from a witness who claimed to have spotted Michelle Whitaker. The caller explained that they were watching a Forensic Files episode about Jonathan Vick when Michelle's picture flashed on the screen. The anonymous witness immediately recognized the woman in the photo. It was her next-door neighbor. Oregon and South Carolina investigators were dispatched to the scene, where it was confirmed that Michelle Whitaker had been found alive and well. Michelle was eventually reunited with her family and apologized for running away, and she told them she needed to escape her troubled life and decided to start afresh in Oregon. In December of 2019, Tamara Ecclestone, her husband, Jay, and their daughter were looking forward to Christmas. The family had left their Kensington Palace Gardens home behind for a long holiday in Lapland. The holiday was supposed to be picture perfect, with their daughter meeting Father Christmas and his reindeer, but instead, it turned into a living nightmare. Throughout December, a masked group of thieves broke into the homes of high-profile names across the UK. Tamara Ecclestone was on their radar, as her house alone was worth millions. The robbers somehow made it past security and alarm systems and found their way into the home. Over the course of a few hours, the group stole items worth upwards of £25 million. Jewelry, F1 memorabilia, and other items were swiped, some irreplaceable. Once the men were finished, they called a taxi and drove away into the streets of London. CCTV captured the thieves in action as they crept into Tamara's home. They also caused $10,000 worth of damage to the windy house in the garden. Investigators immediately jumped into action and began questioning taxi drivers on duty that evening. Due to their disguises, it was difficult for witnesses to pick out distinctive facial features. Luckily, one taxi driver, Terry, had an excellent memory and recalled taking the men to the Hilton Hotel that evening. After this, the men hailed another taxi, which took them to St. Mary Cray, just outside of London, bordering Kent. Thanks to CCTV footage, the Metropolitan Police tracked their movements to TLK Apartments, a cheap hotel chain. According to Detective Con Grimshaw, he acted on a hunch and went to speak to the hotel's receptionist. The receptionist told investigators a bizarre story about that December 2019 evening. As she checked the men in, she asked for a copy of their ID for records. Later that evening, she received an explicit picture from one of the men. The police were able to trace the number the image had been sent from and found that it belonged to 23-year-old Italian national Yugoslav Jovanovic. When the files were pulled, investigators found a copy of Yugoslav's ID from December of 2019. Days later, the police identified another man, Alessandro Maltese, and 45-year-old Alessandro Donati, both Italian nationals. Several other men were also arrested in connection with the spate of robberies, although the alleged ringleader, Croatian Daniel Vukovic, is still at large. Yugoslav was sentenced to 11 years in prison, while Alessandro Donati and Alessandro Maltese were sentenced to 8. All 3 men were extradited from Italy to serve their sentences in the UK. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.